Hey guys, tonight we bring the remarkable story of medieval's time. Before you comfortable, like and subscribe the video, and if you really enjoy, let me in the comment section. Dims the lights and maybe turn on the fan for smooth background. So let's start the story. Imagine you are suddenly dropped into a medieval village sometime in the year 1250. The first thing you notice isn't the sight, but the smell. It is thick, pungent, earthy, and utterly overwhelming. Smoke from wood fires mixes with the sharp tang of animal dung, the sour stench of sweat, and the faint but unmistakable odor of waste tossed into ditches. There is no soft mattress to cradle your body. Instead, you wake on a lumpy straw mattress, crawling with lice and fleas that nip at your skin. The straw is old and damp, and the wool blanket above you is rough and scratchy. You shift uncomfortably, only to find yourself sharing the bed with others, siblings, cousins, maybe even a parent. Privacy is not a luxury you can afford in this world. Morning comes not with the gentle sound of an alarm clock, but with the shrill crow of a rooster. The sunlight peeks through cracks in wooden shutters, and the cold of dawn seeps into your bones. Eating is provided only by the smoldering ashes of last night's fire if it hasn't gone out entirely. When you sit up, you feel the stiffness in your body. Medieval people were accustomed to hard labor, but for someone like you, softened by modern comforts, the ache of sleeping on straw would already feel unbearable. Worse still, your clothes are the same ones you wore yesterday and the day before. In fact, most peasants owned only one or two sets of clothing worn until they literally fell apart. You pull the wool tunic over your head, already itching from the coarse fabric, and then comes breakfast, or rather the lack of forget pancakes, eggs, or a steaming cup of coffee. In the medieval world, breakfast was meager if it existed at all. For the poor, it might be nothing more than a hunk of coarse stale bread, dipped in watered down ale. Bread was the cornerstone of survival, but it was far from the fluffy loaves you know today. Made from barley, rye, or oats, it was dense, heavy, and often mixed with filler like ground beans or even sawdust during times of scarcity. If you were unlucky, the bread could be moldy, but hunger made people less picky. A spoonful of cold porridge, what medieval people called pottage, might accompany it. This was a thin, tasteless gruel made by boiling grains in water. If you were particularly fortunate, there might be a scrap of onion or leek to add flavor. Meat, that was a rare luxury for peasants, reserved for festivals or stolen bites when hunting illegally in a lord's forest. As for water, it was often unsafe to drink. Wells could be contaminated, rivers and streams polluted by waste. That is why ale was the safer choice even for children. But this small ale wasn't the frothy, rich beer of modern pubs. It was weak, flat, and barely alcoholic, just enough to kill the bacteria that might otherwise make you violently ill. By the time you have swallowed your meager breakfast, your stomach is far from satisfied. But there is no time to complain. The fields are waiting, and in the medieval world, survival meant work from sunup to sundown. The moment the sun crests the horizon, you are expected work. If you are a peasant, as most were, your days spent in the fields. You grab the tools, crude wooden plows, heavy iron hoes, or a sickle for cutting grain, and head out with your family. The work is back-breaking, repetitive, and relentless. You turn the soil, plant seeds, feed the fields, and haul water. The earth is stubborn, the tools are primitive, and your body quickly grows sore. Modern people used to 8-hour workdays and weekends off would find this schedule unthinkable. In the medieval world, you worked 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, with only Sundays and holy days for rest. Even then, rest usually meant attending church services, not lounging in leisure. Children, too, had no escape. From as young as 7, boys and girls worked alongside their parents, herding animals, gathering firewood, hauling water, and tending the household. Childhood, as you understand it, simply didn't exist. And what if you were not a peasant but a craftsman in town? Then your day was spent in workshops thick with smoke and dust. Blacksmiths sweated over glowing forges, carpenters hammered endlessly, and tanners endured the stench of rotting hide soaked in urine, a necessary step in making leather. Your lungs would burn, your back would ache, and your hands would be calloused and scarred within weeks. For women, work was no lighter. They rose early to grind grain by hand, knead dough, milk cows, churn butter, spin wool, weave cloth, and cook meals over open flames. Even when pregnant, women labored on, only pausing long enough to give birth before returning to their duties. And all of this was done under the shadow of feudal obligation. The land you tilled was not yours. It belonged to a lord, and for the privilege of farming it, you paid taxes, often in grain, livestock, or long hours of unpaid labor on the lord's estate. Huh? Failed to meet these obligations, and punishment could be harsh. By midday, you are exhausted. Sweat runs down your back, blisters form on your hands, and your stomach growls from the thin breakfast. Yet the day is only half over. And even as you toil, danger lurks, disease, injury, or the threat of a passing soldier looking for a recruit. This is why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times. If you think slipping into clean, fresh clothes each morning is normal, think again. In medieval times, clothing was both scarce and uncomfortable. For peasants, a single wool tunic might have to last for years. The wool was coarse, scratchy, and impossible to keep free from fleas, leaves, and dirt. Underneath, a linen shirt or shift might be worn, if you were lucky enough to own one. Washing these clothes was rare. Soap was primitive, made from lye and animal fat, and water for laundering meant hauling bucket after bucket from the village well. Your body too was rarely washed. Bathing was viewed with suspicion in some regions, linked with sin or disease. In towns there were bathhouses, but they were expensive, and eventually many were shut down for being associated with immorality. For peasants, washing meant splashing your face with cold water and maybe a full rinse in a river during summer. The result? A constant stink of sweat, dirt, and unwashed bodies. Fleas burrowed into your clothes, lice lived in your hair, infections festered in wounds that never truly healed. Even royalty was not free from this misery. King Henry VIII, for example, owned dozens of lavish outfits, yet his personal hygiene was questionable at best. Perfume and scented herbs often served as cover ups for filth. Teeth were another story. Toothbrushes did not exist in the form we know. Some rubbed their teeth with rags dipped in salt or herbs, but decay was rampant. By the time someone reached middle age, missing teeth, rotting gums, and constant toothaches were normal. The modern person, used to showers, deodorant, clean socks, and fresh laundry, would quickly wilt under these conditions. The constant itching, the foul smell, and the feeling of grime on your skin would drive you mad. And yet, for medieval folk, this was simply life. Now imagine cutting your finger while chopping wood. Today you'd wash it, disinfect it, and slap on a bandage. In medieval times, that tiny cut could kill you. Without antibiotics, infections often spread quickly. A simple scrape could lead to blood poisoning, fever, and death within days. Medicine was based more on superstition than science. Doctors followed the teachings of Galen, an ancient Roman physician who believed in the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, they thought, came from these humors being out of balance. The cure? Bleeding. Patients were often drained with leeches or cuts, making them weaker instead of stronger. If you had a headache, a doctor might recommend drilling a hole in your skull to release the evil spirit. If you had the plague, you might be advised to carry sweet-smelling herbs or inhale smoke. None of it worked. And then there were the great killers, diseases that swept through villages like wildfire. The Black Death of the 14th century is the most infamous, wiping out up to half of Europe's population. Imagine your entire village disappearing in months, bodies piled in pits, priests muttering hurried prayers as bells tolled endlessly. But even outside of plagues, life was short. Smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, and dysentery were constant threats. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could endure, with many mothers and infants dying during labor. The average life expectancy was around 30 to 40 years, not because people simply dropped dead at that age, but because so many children never survived to adulthood. If you were lucky enough to reach old age, your body would be bent and broken from years of toil. Arthritis, blindness, and chronic pain haunted the elderly, who rarely had comfort in their final years. For a modern person, even catching a cold in this world could be fatal. Without clean hospitals, sterile equipment, or reliable medicines, you would not last long. Suppose you were accused of stealing bread from the Lord's granary. In modern times, you would be entitled to a trial with evidence, lawyers, and perhaps a fair sentence. In medieval times, justice was harsh, swift, and often bizarre. Courts relied on a trial by ordeal. To prove your innocence, you might be forced to plunge your hand into boiling water and then wait 3 days. If the wound healed cleanly, you were innocent. If it festered, you were guilty. Another method was trial by combat, where the accused fought their accuser or a champion chosen to fight for them. Victory was proof of divine favor, defeat meant guilt, and usually death. Punishments were brutal. A thief might have his hand chopped off. A murderer could be hanged, burned, or broken on the wheel. Even minor crimes were met with public humiliation. Stocks and pillories held criminals in place as townsfolk pelted them with rotten food, mud, or worse. The church also wielded power and justice. Heresy, questioning religious authority, was punishable by excommunication, imprisonment, or execution by fire. Witch trials accused countless women of making pacts with the devil, leading to torture and death. For peasants, there was little hope of fairness. Lords, nobles, and church officials controlled the system, and bribes often determined outcomes. Simply being poor was reason enough for suspicion. The Ma'adan person, raised in societies with courts, appeals, and human rights, would find this terrifying. Imagine knowing that a simple accusation, even from a spiteful neighbor, could end your life. Justice in the medieval world was less about fairness and more about maintaining order and fear. At the heart of medieval society was the feudal system, a rigid hierarchy that determined where you stood from the moment you were born. Unlike today, where education, luck, or ambition might allow someone to rise above their circumstances, in the Middle Ages, your birth was your destiny. At the very top was the king who claimed ownership of all land. Below him were powerful nobles, barons, and dukes, who received vast estates in exchange for loyalty and military service. Beneath them were knights bound to serve as warriors. At the very bottom were peasants and serfs, who made up nearly 90% of the population. If you were a serf, you were not technically a slave, but you were far from free. You could not leave the land without your lord's permission. You owed him taxes and labor, and even your children were bound to the estate. For life was measured in bushels of grain, days of plowing, and coins paid at harvest time. Want to marry, you might need the Lord's approval. Want to hunt a rabbit in the forest to feed your starving family? Illegal, the forest belonged to the Lord. Want to quit farming and try a new life in town? Dangerous, the Lord could send men to drag you back. For the medieval peasant, freedom was a dream that rarely came true. Some escaped to growing towns where, after living for a year and a day without capture, they could earn freedom. But even there, poverty and disease stopped them. The modern mind used to rights, liberties, and choices would feel suffocated in this world. To know that your labor, your family, and even your very body belong to someone else is a reality that few today could endure. Now imagine working in your fields when suddenly a horn blows in the distance. Raiders? War was never far in the Middle Ages. Neighboring lords feuded constantly, kings battled for power, and foreign invaders swept across borders. Ordinary people bore the brunt of this violence. Knights in shining armor might sound romantic in stories, but in reality they were terrifying. Heavily armed men on horseback could trample peasants without hesitation. Their swords and lances were made for war, not chivalry. If your village lay in the path of an army, you might see your home burned, your livestock stolen, and your family slaughtered. Sieges were even worse. When castles were attacked, surrounding villages were often stripped bare to feed soldiers. If you were trapped inside a besieged castle, hunger would drive you to eat rats, dogs, and even chew leather. Disease spread quickly in cramped conditions, and starvation was a slow, agonizing death. Violence was not limited to wars. Bandits roamed the countryside. A trip from one village to another could be fatal if you were unlucky. Roads were few and dangerous, often little more than muddy tracks filled with thieves waiting for easy prey. The battlefield itself was a nightmare. Without gunpowder, at least until the late Middle Ages, battles were fought with swords, axes, maces, and arrows. Wounds were horrific. Limbs severed, skulls crushed, cuts spilled onto the mud. There were no clean bandages, no anesthesia, no safe hospitals. A wounded soldier often faced a slow death from infection. Modern people, accustomed to peace, police protection, and standing armies that prevent chaos, would be horrified. Imagine knowing that at any moment, armed men could sweep through your home and there was nothing you could do, was nothing you could do. Religion in the Middle Ages was not simply a personal belief. It was the foundation of life, law, and order. From the moment you woke to the moment you died, The church was present, shaping every decision. Mass was mandatory, and holy days punctuated the year. Well, baptism, marriage, confession, and burial were all under church control. Priests were not merely spiritual leaders but also keepers of knowledge, teachers, and sometimes even judges. To oppose the church was to risk your soul and your life. Fear was a powerful tool. Hell was described in vivid detail: fire demons, eternal torment. To sin was to risk damnation, and since few could read the Bible themselves, they relied on priests to interpret God's will. Superstition thrived. Comets were signs of doom, storms of punishments, and illness could mean God's anger. Tithes or taxes to the church were collected from even the poorest peasants. Refuse to pay, and your eternal soul might be threatened with excommunication. In many cases, this meant being cast out of society entirely. No one would trade with you, help you, or even bury you, other than bury you. And then there were the Inquisition. Those accused of heresy, disagreeing with church teachings, were interrogated, tortured, and often executed. Witches, heretics, and supposed devil worshippers were burned at the stake, their screams echoing in the village square as a grim warning. Religion also brought hope, of course. Cathedrals rose like mountains of stone, filled with light and song. Pilgrimages offered spiritual rewards, rigs were said to heal the sick, and prayers gave comfort in times of famine or plague. But the balance of hope and fear was fragile, and fear often won. For the modern person raised in a world where science explains disease, where the law is separate from religion, and where free thought is valued, the suffocating grip of the medieval church would feel unbearable. Every moment of life was shadowed by the fear of eternal punishment. When the long hours of labor were done, what did medieval people do for fun? The answer is complicated and for a modern visitor, often disturbing. Entertainment was scarce, but when it came, it was raw, loud, and frequently cruel. On holy days or during village fairs, peasants gathered for music, dancing, and games. Minstrels played lutes and sang ballads, while jugglers and jesters amused crowds with tricks and sharp humor. Wrestling matches, tug of war, and simple games like dice or board games such as Nine Men's Morris filled spare hours. Children played with wooden dolls' hoops and balls stuffed with rags. But not all amusements were innocent. Animal baiting, forcing dogs to fight bears, bulls, or chain wild animals was a common spectacle. Cockfighting drew crowds who bet on the bloody outcome. In some towns, cats were thrown into bonfires during festivals, cheered on by laughing crowds. Public executions were also considered entertainment. When a thief was hanged or a traitor beheaded, people turned out in droves. It was both a warning and a holiday atmosphere with vendors selling food and drinks as if it were a carnival. The suffering of others became a spectacle for all to witness. For nobles, entertainment was grander but equally violent. Jousting tournaments saw knights charging at each other with lances, risking broken bones and death. Hunting was a favorite pastime of the aristocracy, with vast forests reserved for their sport. For them, chasing deer, boar, or even wolves was both a game and a display of dominance. Religion also shaped leisure. Pilgrimages were a mix of devotion and travel, with groups walking hundreds of miles to holy sites. Along the way, markets thrived, inns filled with laughter, and travelers shared songs and stories. To a modern person used to theaters, movies, sports, and digital entertainment, medieval amusements would feel both primitive and unsettling. The laughter of the crowd at a man's hanging or the cheer at a bear's suffering would leave you shaken. Leisure in this age was often built on pain, struggle, and survival. Daylight in the medieval world was harsh enough, but nightfall was worse. Without electricity, darkness was absolute. Candles were expensive, torches smoky and dangerous, and most peasants relied only on the dim glow of a hearth fire. Step outside, and you were swallowed by blackness. The night was filled with fear. Wolves and wild dogs prowled the edges of villages. Bandits and thieves lurked on roads, waiting for travelers. The creak of wood, the howl of wind, or the rustle in the fields could send shivers down your spine. In a world where superstition reigned, the night was believed to be the realm of spirits, demons, and witches. Most people stayed indoors once the sun set. Doors were barred, shutters closed, and families huddled together around the fire. Yet, even inside, safety was not guaranteed. Fires could rage out of control, rats could gnaw through food stores, and sickness often struck hardest in the cold, damp hours before dawn. Beds, when they existed, were shared. Families slept together on straw or wooden frames, sometimes with livestock kept indoors for warmth. The air was heavy with smoke, sweat, and animal odor. Privacy did not exist. Every sound, cough, or whimper was heard by all. Dreams, too, carried meaning. For a bad dream could be interpreted as a warning, a sign of sin, or even a message from God. The line between the natural and the supernatural blurred in the dark. For a modern visitor, the sheer silence and blackness of a medieval night would be unsettling. Without the hum of electricity, the glow of streetlights, or the comfort of secure locks, night would feel endless. Every shadow would seem threatening, every noise a danger. You would pray for the rooster's crow to bring the light of dawn. So now, after walking through a single day in medieval life, you understand why survival would be nearly impossible for someone from the modern world. From the moment you woke on a lumpy straw bed itching with lice, to the meager breakfast of stale bread and ale, to the endless hours of backbreaking labor, life in the Middle Ages was unforgiving. Hunger gnawed constantly, disease lurked in every wound, and the law was cruel and swift. Your body would struggle against the rough clothes, the filth, and the lack of rest. Fear was constant. Fear of lords, of soldiers, of bandits, of disease, and most of all, of damnation. Entertainment came in the form of suffering, leisure, and fleeting songs and cruel games. At night, the darkness pressed down, filling your heart with unease. Would you survive? Perhaps a day if luck was with you, but a week, a month, a year, the odds were slim. The strength, endurance, and resilience required to live in medieval times are beyond what most modern people could bear. And yet, people did survive. They worked, they laughed, they loved, and they built the foundations of the world we live in today. Their lives were short and harsh, but through their struggles came resilience, tradition, history, and history. So, the next time you feel bored, restless, or complain about modern inconveniences, remember in the Middle Ages you wouldn't